Hello, and welcome to the Narcissus Now podcast series, featuring artists and thinkers from Narcissus Now, the Myth Reimagined, an arts and ideas festival celebrating the newly renovated Onassis Cultural Center in New York. The festival is a 4-day celebration and inquiry into the dynamic, complex, and intriguing myth of Narcissus. The voices that you will hear in this series are those of people who are taking part in the festival, either as performers or thinkers, people who have shared their knowledge and insight into the relevance of this legendary myth and how it plays out in contemporary culture. My name is Tani Katenjian, and here I speak with scholar and historian Angelos Chaniotis, professor, author, and researcher focusing on the Hellenistic world and the Roman East. The work he has done has changed the way the ancient world is seen and understood. His current work focuses on emotions, identity, and memory, but he has long explored the ways in which myths and rituals from the ancient world are communicated and understood today. Born in Athens, Greece, he was raised with the telling and retelling of myths, which may have been the inspiration for his interest in epigraphy, religion, and cultural history. We spoke by phone, with me in San Francisco and him in New York. Stay tuned.
Narcissus, or Narcissus, as his name would have been pronounced in ancient Greek, was actually a very important hero in the city of Eretria, one of the civic subdivisions, one of the tribes of Eretria, was named after Narcissus, and it was the tribe Narcitis, and you do not name a tribe after someone who does not have a very good reputation. Apart from the versions that we know from the literary sources, there were also stories that were narrated about Narcissus as a hunter, as a hero, as a founder, as an adventurer. But of course, the one aspect of his life that really inspired ancient literature is his tragic love, falling in love to himself. And I think that what is interesting in this, in these myths, this is why I will not be talking about one myth, is that in many ways they epitomize human experiences, but also human fears. On the one hand, you have the element of an experience that possibly or perhaps everyone has made in one's life, which is the unreturned love. And Narcissus is actually, first of all, the one who provokes love and does not return it. And this is also what causes ultimately his own disaster. He is a hunter, he follows Artemis, and as a follower of Artemis, he remains a male virgin. Women fall in love in Narcissus, and he doesn't return the love. And it is interesting in this element that unreturned love can in a sense be regarded as an act of injustice, because the one side has a surplus of affection and this affection is not being returned. And I think one of the very interesting elements in the myth is that the goddess who punishes Narcissus is Nemesis, the goddess of retribution. So in a sense, it is an act of punishment, the fact that he falls in love in his own image. So this I find a very interesting element, the unreturned love that acquires a tragic dimension by the fact that Narcissus is paid in exactly the same way. And interestingly, the one who doesn't return his love is himself or his image.
Yes, I found that absolutely fascinating too, that bit, that in the end that it was his own self that didn't return his love. So he really got a taste of what he had been giving for most of his life. Now, back to the hero bit, what makes someone a hero? What does a hero mean exactly? When you think of Narcissus as a hero, what does that mean?
It means achieving something that goes beyond the normal human measure. This is either being very successful in certain adventures, or traveling and founding cities, or experiencing something that goes beyond the normal human experience. The problem is that in the case of Narcissus, we do not have enough information about what made him a leader or the founder of a civic subdivision. Perhaps it is the fact that he is a hunter, and hunters were regarded in a sense as prototypes or archetypes of the young male. He is someone who lives in the wilderness, he experiences adventures, and in this way he may be regarded as a model for future citizens. He may be someone who protects the territory of the city, someone who lives outside of the urban center and protects the borders of the city. Perhaps connected with this is the fact that according to one tradition, his father was Amarinthos. Now, Amarinthos is the name of a settlement near Eretria, and also the site of an important sanctuary of Artemis. So this may indicate perhaps that Narcissus was regarded as a hero, as a protector of the borders of his community.
When you first learned that he had been, that this new information had come out, were you surprised? I mean, given what you know about him and the myth, were you surprised that he was a hero, or what were your perceptions of Narcissus?
Certainly, because we usually associate Narcissus and narcissism with something negative, and you do not expect someone who is associated with negative feelings to be regarded as the founder hero of a subdivision of a quite important Greek city. But this, again, if you think about it, is not that surprising, because there are a lot of cases in which heroes have changes in their perception. The same applies, for instance, to heroes such as Orestes, who is someone who killed his mother, but he can still be regarded as a positive figure. It can be seen in several cases. And so, despite the initial surprise, even this interpretation of Narcissus fits patterns of Greek culture. So the initial surprise can be overcome if one places Narcissus in the context of Greek culture.
Now, there's a line that I read somewhere about how Narcissus's mother was told that her son would die if he knew himself. And there's a lot of talk about the importance of knowing yourself and discovering yourself and better understanding who you are. Can you speak more to that idea of knowing yourself within this myth, and how there was a warning of that, and you know what that means exactly?
Yeah, well, this seems to me like a relatively late element in the traditions about Narcissus, the philosophical interpretation of a myth, which is something that, again, happens very often in myths. They are associated with allegories, with philosophical ideas. I think that the original element is not so much knowing yourself, but knowing the limits. And there are a lot of elements of transgression in the myth of Narcissus. First of all is the fact that Narcissus, as a young man, refuses to return the love and affection of others. This is an element that we find, for instance, also in the case of another mythical figure, Hippolytus, for instance, who is also a follower of Artemis, and for this reason he provokes the anger of Aphrodite, because he is not interested in love affairs. Then there is the element of transgression in the fact that Narcissus falls in love in something that goes beyond normality. His story is very similar to other stories of impossible love affairs. For instance, young men who fall in love in statues. This is as impossible a love affair as falling in love in your own image. And again, the element of image is important in all these cases. There we have the story, for instance, of a young man who saw the statue of the Cnidian Aphrodite, a work by Praxiteles, and fall in love not in Aphrodite, but in the image of Aphrodite. So he used to go into the temple and whisper words of affection to the statue until one night he tried to rape the statue. Soon after, he had to commit suicide. And there is another story about a young man who falls in love with the statue of Agathé Teche, the Good Fortune, in Athens. Again, another work of Praxiteles. It seems to be that Praxiteles was provoking, or his statues were provoking such emotions. Again, he was so desperate in an impossible love that he again committed suicide. In the case of Narcissus, the transgression is falling in love in his own image, and the tragedy is that whenever he tries to approach the image, that is, the image that he sees on water, mirrored in water, he destroys the image that he loves. And this is yet another element of that reminds, for instance, the stories of Sisyphus, who is rolling a stone and the stone is rolling back, or the Danaids, who are trying to fill a jar with water, but the jar is full of holes. So Narcissus is again in many ways a similar figure, because his efforts are in vain. He will never be able to reach the object of his desire. So it's I think that the original element is not knowledge of oneself, but it is knowledge of one's limits as a human being.
When you first heard of the myth, and it was probably a long time ago, I'm sure, it's considering how long you've been studying these things, was your reaction a positive one or a negative one?
Well, it was sadness, and being Greek, of course, and belonging to a generation in which the study of mythology started at a very early age. When you're 5 or 6, you are first encounter Greek myths, and you visit museums, and you read simple narratives of Greek mythology. So I think that the first time that I heard about the myth of Narcissus must have been when I was, 6, 7, that age. And it is a very, very sad story, but it is a sadness, I think, that derives primarily from the fact that all the efforts of Narcissus are in vain, the fact that he himself destroys his own image by trying to approach the image. This was the element that I somehow recall as being the saddest element in his story.
Now, this might seem kind of strange, what I'm about to say, but I'm in my 30s, and you hear about my friends who are not coupled with someone. I am coupled with someone, but who aren't coupled with someone, that they, want to be with someone, a man, and that he constantly shoos them away, and that they may be more interested in themselves, more self-centered. This is a regular story you hear amongst my peer group of women who are wanting to be with someone, but that someone is generally more focused on themselves. So there's a very contemporary feel to this myth. I mean, it feels very like a story I've heard many times. Do you think that seems like a stretch, or do you think that's the reason why it has remained so popular to this day?
Greek myths acquire at some point a life of their own. And on the one hand, myths are traditional stories, and as traditional stories they may be fossils that do not develop any further, but the perception of a Greek myth, that is the way that Greek myths inspire ideas, thoughts, emotions, and so on, go far beyond what the original meaning of a myth was. And what you describe, I think, is one of the most interesting elements, not only of the myth of Narcissus, but of myths, both Greek, Roman, but all myths in general, as traditional stories, that they trigger emotions that correspond to basic features of an entirely different society. This is why they become archetypical, why they are eternal. They can be narrated again and again and again, because every generation, every society, every culture can discover some elements in these myths that seem interesting. And of course, we live in an entirely different society, in urban centers where anonymity may be a very important problem, in which we encounter, not only in our everyday life, but also on the screen of the TV, in YouTube, in our iPod, and so on, stories about personal relations. And all this makes the way that we perceive an ancient myth an entirely different matter than the way the myth was originally narrated and understood by the ancient Greeks or the Romans. And this, I think, also explains the fact that certain elements in the myth of Narcissus are isolated and become negative elements. The thing that is isolated in the case of Narcissus, one forgets about the background and the details of the story, and what one focuses on is narcissism, that is the element of self-absorption, being interested only in oneself, a form of egoism, and so on. And these are things that, as I explained before, do not seem to have been the really important elements of the myth as it was narrated in ancient times.
There's a couple of things that you brought up that I want to refer to. The first one is you brought up some of these more contemporary means of expressing ourselves, YouTube and Facebook, let's say, and others. And one of the reasons why the theme of this Arts and Ideas Festival is narcissism is because we live in a seemingly very narcissistic time where we're constantly focusing on ourselves, taking photos of ourselves, sharing those photos with others. How do you think the myth plays out in regards to social media and the way in which we, and certainly the younger generation, explores themselves and expresses themselves in the world?
Yeah, this is a very good question, and I think that one of the most narcissistic elements that we find in our society and in the use of the social media is the fact that some people define their success by the number of likes that they get on Facebook or Twitter and so on. This is a form of narcissism. Sharing things that under different circumstances or in different societies you wouldn't have shared with others, and expecting to get some feedback in the form of like, and counting how many followers one has in Facebook or Twitter and so on, and also presenting almost every element of everyday life in the form of photographs and selfies and so on in the social media. And I think that this is an aspect that of course did not exist in any other known society before our times because of the lack of these media, that provides yet another possibility for reinterpretation of an ancient myth and highlighting one particular element, that is that looking at your own image and liking your own image and expecting others also to respond to this in a positive way. We are in a society in which we pay tremendous attention in the way we are seen by others. Of course, in every society, you have elements of fine clothing and dressing and haircut and so on. But I think that quantity does make a difference, and the intensity with which our society focuses on this element is something really extraordinary. And I cannot say unique because I do not have an overview of all historical periods, but it is certainly something that is much stronger felt and perceived than it was when I was a teenager or in my 20s.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure just by virtue of the technology, something that even if you don't know the history of all cultures, just the virtue of that this technology didn't exist prior to this makes it seem like it must be a unique time. So when someone says now, "Oh, he's such a narcissist," or or even in the kind of world of psychiatry where they say that there's a narcissistic disorder, narcissistic human disorder, do you think that that's a misnomer? Do you think the term has been it's just been misused and misunderstood?
Well, we have also Oedipus complex and other cases of Greek myths that have been used in order to denominate mental disorders or psychological problems and psychological conditions. I am not at all disturbed at this, even if there is always an element of misunderstanding in such denominations, because I think this is a way Greek culture lives throughout the century. So this is not something that really disturbs me. It might have disturbed poor Narcissus, but well, unfortunately, he doesn't have any advocates today. Narcissism has really become a very negative notion, but as I explained at the beginning, there is really a tragedy in the story of Narcissus, and this tragedy is an element that is pushed a little bit aside by the focus on the negative element of the love of oneself and ignoring the response, the environment and the others.
Well, there's a lot of talk about the importance of loving yourself. In Buddhism, for instance, there's a talk of the importance of giving yourself love and compassion so that you can have the strength to give others the same. And in many of these studies around happiness, and there is a tremendous amount about generosity towards others, but there's also a focus on the self and knowing the self and loving the self. Where does that line become drawn? It's a fine line. And where does that line become drawn?
Yes, I think that the important thing is how feeling well with your own self, not necessarily adoring yourself, but feeling well with yourself has an impact on your relations to others. So it is a matter of the interpersonal relations, and the line is drawn when the obsession with feeling with yourself or feeling well about yourself and loving yourself is something that does not improve the interpersonal relations, but is an obstacle to the relations between you and the others.
As Americans, we don't grow up with these sorts of myths and things that actually teach us the morals of maybe become our moral structure. Is that still common today, where the children in Greece learn these myths so that their moral structure can be built? And how much of a role do myths continue to play?
Yeah, well, the Greek educational system has suffered more reforms than any other educational system, and mythology is one of the victims of these reforms. That it is not really part of the education as it used to be. My days, I went to school in the 60s, but in Greek culture, mythology, even not as part of the educational system, is something that is part of life because of its importance for the identity of the Greeks, for their self-representation. So it's something that you do find, if not in the school books and the educational system, you find it in TV, you find it all in the urban setting through the images that are decorating the Greek cities and so on. But I think that what you describe, that is the lack of traditional stories that can be used as a form of teaching, explains also the popularity of classes on mythology in American universities. That is something that the educational system or the family in America does not offer, becomes a demand among undergraduate students who take classes in mythology, despite the fact that they do not want to study classics per se, or they don't want to become classicists, but they want to learn more about these traditional stories, because they play such an important part, not only for the understanding of literature and art and theater and so on, but also for the understanding of human relations and human behavior.
Which is what you're interested in. I mean, part of what you're interested in, human emotions, and isn't that correct?
Yes, I had a research project when I was in Oxford for 5 years, which was a study of the social and cultural importance of emotions in the Greek world. When I started that project, I thought that I would be studying history in order to understand emotions, and then very soon I discovered that actually I should be studying emotions in order to be able to understand history, because there is no aspect of history, whether political history, religious history, history of culture, history of even of economy and so on, that is not somehow related to emotions, and to understand the emotional background of historical processes is extremely important and to a great extent neglected until today.
Absolutely. So when we think of Narcissus, the first emotion that you mentioned was sad, or in the very beginning you mentioned tragic. What are some other emotions that come up when thinking about that myth?
Well, one needs to differentiate between emotions that we as contemporary people may feel when reading various versions of the myth, and what are emotions that played a part in the ancient narrative of the myth. And one of the elements that certainly is important in ancient times is the element of indignation. Indignation at the behavior of this arrogant, in a sense, young man who does not return the love of others. And I think that if we see his punishment, that is, he is a hunter. Another god who is a hunter, or a god who is a hunter, is Eros, the god of love, and who shoots his arrows and makes people fall in love. There is another story that I think has a similarity to the story of Narcissus and his punishment for not returning love to others. And this is the story of a young man who was entirely indifferent at the suffering of a man who fell in love with him. And while he was walking past a statue of Eros, the personification of love, the statue fell on that young man and killed him. So it was again a punishment for not returning love, or not showing interest or compassion or empathy towards the feeling of others. So I think that there is an element of indignation in the stories narrated about Narcissus. The predominant element is the element of disappointed hope. Narcissus sees his image, he falls in love in the image, and of course there is always an expectation of return. There is a hope in the feeling of affection, desire, and love, and this hope is entirely destroyed by Narcissus himself, because the moment he tries to approach his own image, he destroys this image. And this is the despair of Narcissus that ultimately leads him to his suicide.
So I'm going to ask a couple of personal questions. What do you feel personally in your own life that you've learned from this myth, and how do you incorporate what you've learned into your life, specifically from this myth?
Yeah, well, I don't think that it was ever my number one favorite myth, but certainly an element that is important is to know what you can really reach for. That is, to set certain limits to the expectations and to your desires. That is, to, in a sense, to connect emotion with cognition. That is, to understand how far you can go, what you can expect to reach and to achieve, and what not. But again, this, I think, is something that characterizes my personality. That is the fact that I try to keep emotions, in a sense, under control. And the myth of Narcissus is a case, as I explained again before, with falling in love into impossible partners, such as statues or your own image. This is, I think, a very important element, that is to desire something that it is absolutely impossible ever to achieve. So for me, this was quite an important element.
So when you first start answering this question about limiting what you think you can achieve, I imagine you're talking about personal relationships, but when you first started answering it, I thought to myself, well, I doubt that you, I was saying to myself, I doubt that Professor Chaniotis has kind of limited himself in what he thinks he can achieve, because you've achieved so much. So you're specifically speaking not about what we can achieve, say, professionally, but what we can achieve personally and emotionally? Yes,
it's. I think it's primarily the personal and emotional part, and not the professional. Perhaps my professional success, that is to have achieved things that, or some of them early in my life. I did my PhD when I was 24. I was professor when I was 32. So all these things may be a compensation for the realization that in personal life there are certain things that you cannot achieve.
So do you think that it's important to continue to teach this myth to young children, and why do you think that might be?
I think that it is important to confront them with not only with this myth, but with tragic myths in general, because this is a way people think about, ultimately about themselves. The history of classical scholarship is, in a sense, the history of how contemporary societies look at the past as a kind of mirror through which they understand themselves in a better way. And I think that this is, in general, one of the strengths of the humanities and of ancient history and classical studies. If you take medicine prolongs our life, it makes our life better. If you take technological disciplines or sciences, they make, again, our life easier in many ways. What classics offer is the possibility, while we live, to reflect on our experiences and our life, to think. And this is what makes myths, Greek myths, but also myths from other cultures in general, it gives them longevity. They survive and they pass from generation to generation because they have something to tell to each generation, even if this is not always exactly the same message. It is, actually the word message is perhaps wrong. It's not a teaching or a message what they give. It is that they trigger thoughts, and triggering thoughts is something that never dies. A message can be misunderstood, but the possibility to trigger thoughts and to arouse emotions, this is something that gives classical myths longevity, and perhaps will make them immortal in a sense.
There are other characters, of course, in the myth, like Echo, and I wonder, we don't really focus on, I mean, Echo, of course, now the term is used, and it's because of Echo in this myth that we now call an echo what it is, a response of the same thing that we've said. Do these other sort of ancillary characters, are they equally as important, or are they things that we need to pay attention to as well?
Yes, Echo, first of all, is in a sense mirrors Narcissus himself, because exactly as Narcissus looks at his image, looks at the water and sees a reflection of himself, Echo hears her own voice. So both of them are, in a sense, tragic stories. But for me, when I was rereading the myth, I think the most important secondary character is the goddess Nemesis, the goddess of retribution and punishment, that punishes Narcissus for his behavior. And the reason that I was interested in this is because we have certain ancient literary sources, basically, that show the perception of unreturned love as a form of injustice. And I find this really a fascinating thought, to think of love as an offer, and when this offer is not being returned, to see this as a transaction that has not been taken place, a transaction that has been violated, and this explains its understanding, its perception as a form of injustice that provokes punishment by the goddess of retribution.
Interesting. And so what would be the moral takeaway from Nemesis?
I think the interesting aspect is, again, the aspect of interpersonal relations, that no one can just live alone in the world without and ignore the feelings of others. And this is what Narcissus does. And the moral lesson behind the story is to show empathy. Even if this empathy does not, even if the response to the emotions of others does not really mean to accept them entirely, at least it means to take them into consideration, to try to understand them and behave accordingly, at least to show empathy to what other feels, even if it is impossible to return the affection that another person shows. At least one should try to understand this and to try to deal with this, not simply ignore it.
So give love even if you give love back, or care for someone even if you don't necessarily want to.
Yeah.
Ultimately.
Well, not give love back, but return some form of feeling. If you cannot return the love that another person shows, at least show understanding and not show arrogance or just indifference. I think that the indifference is Narcissus's greatest crime, in a sense, to be indifferent to all other people and concentrate just on the one person that attracts his interest and his affection.
You earlier said that the myth of Narcissus isn't one of your favorite ones, and is it one that you dislike, or how does it sit with you?
Yeah, I think that what is frustrating in this myth and in other myths of the same kind is the extremely unhappy end. Although the unhappy end has another positive aspect, Narcissus becomes a flower, or his name is given to a flower, and this is something that the Greeks did not attribute to entirely negative persons. Another young man, for instance, who becomes a flower is Hyacinthos, who was a lover of Apollo, and then there's a story of Envy, the god of the wind, was also in love in this young man and made that the disc of Apollo hit him and died. So in this case, again, you have a young man who becomes a flower. So for me, the extremely unhappy end of the story is probably the disturbing element. There are, of course, hardly any Greek myths with a happy end. But at least, like in the box of Pandora, there is something that remains there, and this is the element of hope. Even after the tragic end of a story, something goes on. There is a continuity, there is another generation, there is life after death, there is a continuity. In the case of Narcissus, there is nothing of this. It's just an end. And the only thing that survives is just the flower, which perhaps is the only small bright element in this very sad story.
Those were the words of historian and author Angelos Chaniotis. To learn more about his work, please visit the Institute for Advanced Study at ias.edu. This interview is part of a series of podcasts called Narcissus Now, featuring artists and thinkers from Narcissus Now, the Myth Reimagined, an arts and ideas festival celebrating the newly renovated Onassis Cultural Center in New York. For more information, please visit onassisfestivalny.org.